That's true. It is wonderful, but
I'm hoping you can all see that. Ricky, can you see that?
Yes, we can. We're all set.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate the invite to talk to you folks tonight about my first book, Hellmira. This is something I haven't been talking about a lot lately because I have a brand new book coming out, and I'll advertise that in a little bit. Let's start by just addressing why in the world would I want to do research on something so depressing as a POW camp from the Civil War. Now, the story actually is kind of interesting in that I was working on a project that actually is my new book just coming out now. I was working on that project when I wrote a post for Emerging Civil War about the Elmira POW camp, and Chris Mikowski says, well, wait a second, how about writing a book for us? I'm like, well, I've got this other project, well, we'll publish it if you write that book. All right, well, so I set that aside and I took this up. I think in part, I grew up so close to Elmira that I guess they figured that I was in a good position to write this book. But I'll tell you something, it was something of a mystery to me for most of my life to that point, because I remember, growing up, and I live near Dundee, which is only about 30 miles north. And I was in the Elmira area all the time, Horseheads, Elmira, Big Flats. And I was, a history nerd then too, but I had never heard that there was a Civil War POW camp in Elmira. And I was astounded when I got to SUNY Cortland, where I was an undergraduate. I went back to school kind of late, so I was in my mid-20s by then. And I was working with Ellis Johnson, the Civil War professor at SUNY Cortland. And he was telling me about this. I'm like, no way, I would have known about this. There's just no way. Well, he assured me, here I am arguing with a Civil War expert, right? He assured me that it was true. And so I had to go looking into this. And I remember making a trip into Elmira, and I still couldn't find any evidence that this was true, though, of course, I respected my professor. And only later did I discover the reason for this. And that is that here you had a community that wanted to kind of forget its ties to the Civil War. And so you had a case of, civic amnesia at best, or a conspiracy of silence at worst. And I dug into it a little bit and found out why this made some sense. And it all had to do with, at the end of the Civil War, the brouhaha over Andersonville. So I'm sure you all are familiar with Andersonville. If anybody knows about a POW camp from the Civil War, they know about Andersonville. It was the worst of the worst, right? It was run by the Confederacy, deep southern Georgia. It was actually only in business, like Elmira, for about a year. And this was all due to Grant coming east in 1864, taking charge of the Union armies. And the spring campaign, which will become the Overland Campaign, was in the offing. And the Confederates, who were housing most POWs in the Richmond area, with a couple of exceptions, decided that they had to move all the POWs out of Richmond because that would just be too great of a temptation for the Union Army. And so they evacuated Belle Isle and the most infamous ones in the Richmond area. And they put them on trains and they sent them to deep southern Georgia. And down near Americus, they just built a kind of a big fence and threw everybody inside and thought that it was so far south that was well out of reach of the Union Army. Well, this pen in deep southern Georgia became just the scene of some terrible atrocities. Some 40,000 Union soldiers are going to be housed there. There's going to be a casualty rate of about 1/3, 30% to go in and never come out again. Those that do get liberated later are walking skeletons. It was just really very, very ugly. And the news of what was happening at Andersonville started to make it into the papers right at the end of the war. Artists' rendering of emaciated POW started to make it into the papers up north, and there was just a howl of outrage from the North. And when Andersonville was liberated, even more of this made it into the papers. And, not long after the end of the war, the only war crimes trial in the history of the Civil War was held. And the commandant of Andersonville prison was tried for war crimes and will be convicted in this drumhead military court in Washington, D.C. The testimony will make it into the papers and outrage the North even more. And of course, the South, which had just lately essentially lost the war, was very much on the defensive and upset, of course, that the war had ended not in their favor. And their answer to this came to be, what about Elmira? And this became the popular refrain in the South. Every time we would scream about Andersonville, their answer would become, what about Elmira? What about Elmira? And soon Elmira was being called the Andersonville of the North. Well, that is not a nickname that anybody in the North, particularly the people in the Elmira area, wanted to be known for. And so after the camp in Elmira was closed, here's a community that sought for a long, long time just to try to forget what had happened. And so you had a community that just did not want to be known for this. And so, when I went looking, and this is in the 1990s, you really had to know where the camp had been in particular in order to see any evidence at all, monuments or otherwise. This is a monument that was erected in 1992. Again, you had to know where it was in order to find it, not far off Water Street. And this, for the longest time, was the only evidence there was. And this was the project of a social studies teacher in the Elmira area, erected near a waterworks building from the city of Elmira, kind of in the midst of where the camp had been. So this was a mystery that interested me. Now, today, things are a little bit different. Today, after the Sesquicentennial, there were people in the Elmira area that decided that they wanted to remember this after all. Really, it was a missed opportunity because during the Sesquicentennial, they really could have gotten people's attention. But no matter. Now they have erected an original camp building. There was rumors for a long, long time that they had original lumber from an original camp building stored somewhere in Elmira, awaiting the day when it might be, re-erected. And this group, Friends of the Elmira Prison, finally did it. And it stands today near the waterworks, near that very monument, with about 80% the original lumber and hardware. Pretty remarkable. They also erected a replica barracks that you can tour there today from schematics found in the War Department. So very historically accurate. And together it really enhances the experience of touring that area. Another reason that I became interested in this project was the man that you see on your screen now, William B. Reese. This is my third great-grandfather. I learned about him also kind of late in life too. It was actually even later than I learned about the existence of the prison camp. Doing family research, I had a distant cousin tell me when I got in touch with her Hey, did you know that you have a grandfather whose name is on the big Pennsylvania monument at Gettysburg? I'm like, what? No, tell me more. Well, as it turns out, my great grandfather, who was with the 2nd Pennsylvania Bucktails in the infantry, fought at Gettysburg. He was wounded on the first day out on the Baltimore Pike near an orchard that wasn't far from the McPherson barn, about a half mile from the railroad cut. And I still don't know whether he was wounded in the neck or in the knee, because when you look at the documents, some say knee, some say neck. There's no doubt he was wounded, though. And that's probably why he survived the Battle of Gettysburg, honestly. He was never well enough to return to duty and ended up in the Veterans Reserve Corps, or sometimes called the Invalid Corps, where he later served in Elmira and may have served as a guard at the POW camp that his grandson would write about in his book more than 150 years later. So that kind of personal connection gives you a new motivation, I think, right? All right, well, enough about my motivation. You guys want to hear about how the camp comes into being and some of those details. So let's start with some background on POW camps to begin with. The story really starts with this guy here, the Quartermaster General of the Union Army, Montgomery Meigs. If you're not familiar with this guy, this is one of the great unsung heroes of the Union Army. Really has never gotten the credit that he deserved. But Meigs, early in the war, went to Simon Cameron, who was the Secretary of War at the time, and said, we should give some thought to what happens if we hold prisoners, whether that be, erecting some POW camps and, perhaps working on a system of exchange. And Simon Cameron, who was, way too busy lining his own pockets with the deals in the War Department, really was not interested at all in hearing about this. And in part because he, like many, thought that this was going to be a short, bloodless war, that the Union would clearly win because God was on our side, and he didn't want to be bothered with these logistics that he really didn't think were necessary. Well, Meigs didn't take that as the final answer and began to quietly, very quietly, start working on some plans just in case. And it's probably for the best that he did, because the situation would have been much, much worse if Meigs hadn't done any work at all on this. So he began working on the first plan for prisoner exchange. Now, early in the war, prisoner exchanges were very informal. They were handled kind of on the battlefield itself between the commanders. This was too lackadaisical, really, for the comfort of the War Department, but they knew that Abraham Lincoln was very anxious about negotiating some kind of an agreement with the Confederacy, because that would be tantamount to actually recognizing the legitimacy of the Confederacy. And so there were no easy answers here early in the war. One thing that Meigs did do here is he tapped this man to be the Commissary General of Union prisoners, William Hoffman. And one of the things that you'll probably get from this talk is that neither side, Union or Confederacy, gave enough thought to the POW problem, and it will become a great humanitarian failure in the end. And some evidence that the Union certainly did not take the problem seriously enough was in their choice of the Commissary General of Prisoners, because Hoffman wasn't qualified really in any way for this job, except that he was a former POW himself. He had been captured in Texas very early in the war. And in fact, the only reason he got the job was he happened to be in Washington, D.C., awaiting exchange. He and Meigs got into a conversation, and Meigs basically said, well, Bill, what are you doing next? Well, I don't know. Well, tell you what, I got a job for you. I need somebody to take charge of this. So his only real qualification was that he was unemployed in Washington and had been a POW. It wasn't that he had any qualifications or a lot of administrative experience or, experience with exchange. He just happened to be available and knew how to take orders, and that's how he got the job. Now, the situation really grows much, much worse after the Battle of Shiloh. The Battle of Shiloh, of course, was the first big battle of the Civil War in April 1862. It was fought in the middle of nowhere on the Tennessee-Mississippi border, and over the course of 2 days produces about 24,000 casualties, blue and gray. 24,000. The number of doctors was inadequate. The number of ways to treat these men was inadequate. The transportation to transport these men someplace else was inadequate. It was just a really bad situation. For the Confederacy, Corinth, Mississippi was only about 25 miles south. And so they left their dead and many of their wounded on the battlefield and left that to the Union to deal with. And they retreated back to Corinth with those that could be moved. But for the Union, it was a lot worse than that, because we had to put them on steamboats and float them up the rivers to places, hundreds and hundreds of miles upstream, like Cairo and Paducah, where we didn't have any POW facilities really ready. It's just that it was a fly by the seat of your pants kind of an emergency, and we had to grab old rundown penitentiaries and old fairgrounds and anything we could get really in the emergency. Of course, the problem also applied to the wounded, and sadly, so many of the wounded didn't make it alive to hospitals because they had to be moved so very far. Well, after the Battle of Shiloh, that got both sides thinking more seriously that this war was going to be a longer affair, a more bloody affair than anyone ever thought. So after this, when it became clear to both sides that the POWs were going to be an issue, negotiations started after Lincoln agreed to let this happen. He didn't want to make a big deal of it because he still was anxious about the appearance of negotiating with the Confederacy, but he had to recognize that this was a problem that had to be solved. And so the result of this became known as the Dix Hill Cartel. So you see Major General John Dix, a former staff officer on the left, D.H. Hill, one of the more controversial and outspoken Confederate commanders there on the right. There are a lot of fans of D.H. Hill, and I'm sure some of you are familiar with him. But he got sidelined from time to time because he had such a sharp tongue. But for purposes of diplomacy, sometimes that can work well for you, right? And so the Dix Hill Cartel was signed. So an agreement between both sides about how to handle POWs and a system of exchange roughly based on old Mexican War and War of 1812 standards. That seemed to have promise, and it did begin to empty out the POW facilities that had been started. That was very good because disease was already ravaging those populations, and those facilities were a disaster in any case. But the Dix Hill Cartel comes to a halt as a result of the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, I wish I could take more time to take a closer look at this. This is a document that is very, very misunderstood. And I have to tell you that 95 to 99% of the students that I ever meet tell me that this is what freed the slaves. In any case, while it freed no slaves at all when it was signed by President Lincoln in 1863, it did start a conversation about how this changed the nature of the war and what this promised if the North won this war. But this is still yet to be seen in some cases, and some of what we know looking back. But so far as our purposes are concerned here, this really, really complicated the exchange of prisoners and brings it pretty much to a screeching halt. And the biggest problem was how to handle African-American troops. So the Emancipation Proclamation opens the door to the recruitment of African-American soldiers in the Union Army, something that I'm sure you're aware, caused much consternation in the Confederacy and a lot of conversation about what should happen if these soldiers get captured. And you can see here that James Seddon, the Confederate Secretary of War, made it very clear, his take and Jefferson Davis's take on this, that Black soldiers cannot be recognized in any way as soldiers subject to the rules of war. And they absolutely refused to exchange African-American troops. And from this time to the end of the war, while there were many African-Americans taken prisoner, less than half make it alive into POW facilities. Many are killed in the act of surrender. We have pretty extensive accounts on this. But so far as the Dix Hill cartel was concerned, Lincoln was unwilling to abide this, and so it stopped pretty much all prisoner exchange. Now, back to the Overland Campaign I briefly touched on earlier. This was, of course, from the spring of 1864 on. This is going to see more than 6 weeks of pretty much continuous battle between North and South as the Union Army tries to descend on Richmond. One of the things that they did in anticipation of the casualties of the Overland Campaign is to open a new, larger POW camp at a place called Point Lookout. This is on a peninsula in Maryland. And, POW camps, if you look at those that existed, very many times are on islands or on peninsulas because they're easier to defend. Oftentimes they're easier to supply. They're harder to escape from. In the case of Point Lookout, it was close proximity to the Virginia battlefields, but also it was really a good infrastructure situation because here, and if you can see my cursor, is the largest Union General Hospital of the war. This is the Hammond General Hospital. It looks like, the spokes on a big wheel here, right? But this had been in existence for some time. It was quite large, but best of all, the infrastructure was already there to supply it. Ready transportation to and from the peninsula. And so the Union Army thought, this is a place to put a good POW facility. It's got all those advantages. And if you look up here, you'll see this is the POW camp. Eventually, the palisade is a rectangle there. This is the facility for enlisted men. And just down here is the facility that will hold officers. One of the reasons I mentioned Point Lookout is this is the primary feeder to Elmira. So when you look at all the POWs that will be incarcerated at the Elmira POW facility, 95% of those came from Point Lookout. Of course, over the course of the Overland Campaign, Point Lookout busted at the seams eventually, and they had to have another place, for the overflow. And here's a closer look. Now, another thing that happens here is that Ulysses S. Grant finds himself in charge of the POW question. Now, Grant had been brought east because Lincoln liked him, Lincoln trusted him. Of course, Grant had proven himself in ways that many other commanders had not. And Grant was given much, much more leeway than any other commander had ever been given. And even had say over the POW question. And he decided, even when he was given the opportunity to restart prisoner exchange, he decided against it. And you'll see that his rationale is contained here in the quote, "While it's hard on our men, it's humanity to those left in the ranks. Every man we hold when released on parole or otherwise becomes an active soldier against us." And that was his big concern, that the Confederacy was so desperate for men that if we exchanged prisoners, it worked to their advantage. There was very little advantage to us except from the humanitarian standpoint, right? That our men would not suffer at the hands of the Confederates and rot away in POW facilities. So Grant made the determination to stop prisoner exchange because it was too beneficial and it would only end up drawing out the war. He came in for a lot of grief over this too from the Northern public, and it's one of the reasons why he's been called a butcher. All right, now, why Elmira of all places? Because Elmira seems quite far from the battlefields of the Civil War. The closest battlefield, of course, is Gettysburg, and there was only one, well, substantial, but only one battle fought there. Well, Elmira actually made sense from a number of standpoints. One, Elmira, since the very earliest days of the war, had been a major hub of Union activity from New York State. Now, New York State, of course, furnished more soldiers to the Union Army than any other state in the Union. And Elmira made a lot of sense as a funneling point for upstate New York soldiers to get to the war. And so from all over Western and Central New York, men would be moved by rail to Elmira, and from Elmira down to the Virginia battlefields. And a lot of this had to do with the fact that Elmira was a major transportation hub. There was a lot of land already under contract, first by New York State, and then later leases that would be bought out by the federal government. And in the early days of the war, these were points where men would be mustered into the service. They would get their first drilling experience before being put upon trains and moved south. And so that land was still under contract to the federal government later in the war. It became a draft rendezvous. So when the North resorted to a draft, a lot of these barracks reopen, the land is used again, and it's to muster men into the service from the draft. This land and barracks were still available in 1864 when the War Department was grasping about for new POW facilities and for an answer to the Point Lookout problem. And so this just made a lot of sense. And getting the soldiers from Point Lookout to Elmira, could be done by rail. Although they would have to travel up through the mountains of Pennsylvania, that wasn't seen as a big problem. Now, the man who was the post commander in Elmira, there were a number of barracks in Elmira. The one that becomes Elmira was known, or the one that becomes the POW camp is known as Camp Number 3 or Barracks Number 3. The commander was Seth Eastman. Here is a man really not fitted to his position for what is about to happen in Elmira. Seth Eastman was a career officer, so he was a regular Army guy. He, like a regular Army guy with seniority, he knew how to take orders and do what he was told. But this is a guy approaching retirement rapidly. He's not in good health at all. And in fact, what he's mostly interested in at this point in his life is his art. He was quite an up-and-coming artist, or rather, I should say, a well-established artist. And he was known for sculpture, and he was known for his paintings. And later, after the war, he will even be commissioned by the United States Congress to do some high-profile pieces of art that you can still see in the United States Capitol today. But so far as active duty here in Elmira under the stresses of starting a POW camp, this guy was really not up to the job at all. But, you know, they're going to say to him, listen, we need to open a POW camp. We decided on Elmira. They didn't give him a choice. They just told him, right? How many men do you think you can hold there? Well, maybe, he says, 2,500, maybe 4,000. Really? Well, get ready, because 10,000 are going to be on the way soon. All right. Well, yes, sir. And so Eastman does his best to get ready. He starts putting up a palisade and starts to ready what he can for the avalanche of POWs that are about to come his way. But before I move on, let me indulge me in one quick personal story here involving Eastman that I just can't leave alone. And that is the story of his wife. So Seth Eastman was married to a Virginian, and she was an FFV. You ever heard this before, FFV? She was from one of the first families of Virginia, which means that she is from Virginia aristocracy, you know, and so she is right up there with the Randolphs and the Custuses and the Lees and, you know, the big names from Virginia. Her name was Mary Henderson, and she was a proud Virginian, but she married Seth Eastman, and, you know, they had been married for quite some time before he found himself in Elmira. But one of the things that's really interesting about Mary Henderson is that earlier, before the Civil War started, she was irate about this best-selling book called Uncle Tom's Cabin. I'm sure you've heard of it. And Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote this famous book. And being a Virginian, Mary Henderson thought that this was just outrageous. Of course, she knew that Harriet Beecher Stowe had very little personal experience with slavery, and that a lot of this was just hearsay. Though in Harriet Beecher Stowe's defense, you know, she said she was writing fiction, right? But in any case, Mary Henderson decided that this couldn't stand. She could not allow this to stand. And so Mary Henderson decided to write her own version, which became known as Aunt Phyllis's Cabin. So she wrote, it wasn't meant to be a parody. It was meant to be an answer to Uncle Tom's Cabin. And it was going to be a true account of life under slavery. And it never became the bestseller that, of course, Harriet Beecher Stowe's work did. And in fact, it never published more than a couple thousand volumes, which, by the way, are very difficult to find today. But you know, she got satisfaction, she thought, by answering Uncle Tom's Cabin with the true account of what slavery was like, which was quite biased and very pro-slavery, as you might imagine. So that's kind of an interesting fact in and of itself. Well, now, in the 1860s, she finds herself in Elmira, the wife of the post commander. And so it's kind of a sleepy little town. And what really fascinates me here is that Elmira also was the summer home of Harriet Beecher Stowe, the very author of Uncle Tom's Cabin, whose brother was the minister of the first church, and the Park Church in Elmira. And so here, these two ladies, circulating in elite society in Elmira, having written dueling books, may have met each other. And boy, would that be a fly on the wall kind of moment. I have been looking for years for some account where the two of them met, and any eyewitness account, but I have not been able to find a single one. So it just remains a delicious possibility. All right. Now, I want to talk about the beginnings of this camp. So the first commandant was Henry Colt. Henry Colt is from the famous Colt firearms family. He himself was a distinguished soldier. He also was kind of on the injured reserve. He had been injured in battle. He didn't want to leave the service. And so they gave him kind of a cushy, easy job in Elmira to oversee the opening of this POW camp while he convalesced. And what is fascinating to me about Henry Colt is how he was admired, nay, even loved by some of the Confederate POWs. And the reason why I find that so fascinating is if you look at the POW memoirs after the Civil War, and you track down memoirs written by men who were incarcerated at Elmira, all, by the way, written after the Andersonville brouhaha had dusted up, they are filled with just vitriol and complaints about how terrible Elmira was, and the food and the shelter, and just how brutal, how awful this was, and how inhumane, except when it came to Henry Colt. And there are multiple mentions of Henry Colt in these memoirs written by former Confederate prisoners, and they all say pretty much the same thing, that he was just, that he was humane, that he was kind-hearted. This was their jailer, after all, and they're talking about him in these flowery terms, which does make you wonder how bad Elmira really was if their chief jailer was thought of in this loving kind of way. And by the way, the one that wrote kind of the worst of these memoirs was a man named Anthony Kiley, who just wrote absolute poison about his experience in Elmira, except for this guy. And Kiley was overflowing with praise about Henry Colt. And apparently this was more than just words, because Henry Colt and Anthony Kiley went into business with each other in Petersburg after the war. Fascinating. Another piece of evidence that should tantalize you. Henry Colt returns to the war, I think it was December or January 1865. He's well enough to go back into battle. And the POWs gave him a farewell ceremony and gave speeches in tribute, and then gave him this really interesting gift. They presented him a chalice that they had carved on a solid silver platter, a real silver platter. One wonders where POWs got a solid silver platter, but this is what they did. They presented this chalice hand-carved from a piece of limb from a tree, and the bowl of the chalice was half a coconut shell, which I also want to know about. Where in Elmira did you get a coconut shell in 1865? But they did. They did. And apparently it was just beautiful. I wish we still had it. But they gave him this magnificent gift, gave him all these tributes, and yet he is their chief jailer. He is the commandant of the POW camp. And men that were Confederate POWs actually shed tears that this guy was leaving. Anyway, it makes you wonder. It makes you wonder. All right, so the camp gets underway. It's only in existence from July 1864 to July 1865. As I told you, they had thoughts of moving thousands of men from Point Lookout to Elmira by rail, and so they really had to ramp things up pretty quickly. This is an artist's rendering of the outline of the camp, and I just want to point out a few things about it. So the Chemung River is right there, and it's a substantial river if you're not familiar with it. It's not something that you can easily ford, especially when it's running high. You'll see that the back wall of the camp was right on the bank of the river, right up against the river. This is going to be problematic in the spring, but that's the way it was erected. And you'll see the rough shape of the palisade, which encompassed 30 to 40 acres of land. I say 30 to 40 acres of land because now, in just very recent years, there's been some controversy over actually where this wall was. And there's the thought that the wall was further out to the north than what they originally thought. You'll see that on the higher ground, because this is long sloping ground, the barracks were here. You're going to see that the hospitals are going to be over here. These are the quarters for the officers here. Now, down here, about 2/3 of the way down the ground toward the Chemung River is an old farm pond called Foster's Pond. It was a very, very lazy pond, just a farm pond without a stream of fresh water moving through it. And so in the summer, it stagnated. It would get scum over the top, smelled pretty bad. So that's kind of the outline of the camp. Foster's Pond becomes a source of controversy. Because about a month after the camp opened, there was an inspection by a War Department inspector who called attention to this as a problem. Already, it was emerging as a big problem because when the camp was designed, they had set up latrines along the bank of this pond. The latrines were not properly sited, and so feces and urine was seeping from the vaults into the pond and making the whole thing smell really quite bad. And the inspector from the War Department said, well, this is going to make the men ill. They're going to fall from disease. You need to do something about this right away. And really, to me, there's more evidence here that they really did not care much about the welfare of these Confederate prisoners because nothing is done. Even though this inspector said, you must do something because this is going to harm the health of your prisoners, nothing is done, and nothing is done. And it's not until the middle of the fall that they do anything at all. By the way, the pond will also be a source of food, not the fish, because the fish are going to be dead right away, but muskrats. Muskrats lived in holes in the edges of the pond, and they are going to be hunted for food by the starving POWs later. More evidence of kind of disregard for the health of the POWs surrounded the appointment of the chief surgeon, Eugene Sanger. Sanger was also a controversial figure because he had a sharp tongue, he had an abrasive personality, he didn't get along, in fact, with a lot of people. But when he came on the job, he started complaining that he didn't have the supplies that he needed more medicines, he needed better hospital facilities, and he didn't get what he wanted. He had no problem going over everybody's head directly to the War Department. The War Department, as we'll see, was irate about what they were hearing about Andersonville. And so from the early fall of 1864, a lot of what happens in Elmira is about a program of retaliation against the Confederates for the atrocities at Andersonville. And there's a lot of evidence to back this up. So when Sanger went over the head of camp authorities to the War Department complaining he didn't have what he needed, they turned a deaf ear because they're kind of retaliating against the Confederates incarcerated in Elmira. And later, Sanger will make such a big stink that they'll actually send him out of the army and replace him with a man by the name of Stocker, who apparently was hand-chosen because they knew he would be quiet, because Stocker is there from the fall to the time the camp closes, and he files one report, and never complained about anything, which is apparently what the War Department wanted from him. All right, I told you about Anthony Kiley already. Now, Seth Eastman, I told you wasn't up to the job, and his health breaks in the fall of '64. He is replaced by Benjamin Tracy, a much younger man, man that won some distinction on the Virginia battlefield. But he's one of these politician soldiers. He's from upstate New York, a lawyer, politician, lots of friends in the War Department, and he had higher political aspirations after the war. And it looks like Edwin Stanton, who was the Secretary of War for most of the Civil War on the Union side, handpicked Benjamin Tracy, a close friend of his, when Seth Eastman had to step down. And it appears that Tracy knew exactly what Edwin Stanton was going to expect of him. I wish that we had actually written instructions from the Secretary of War to Tracy. We don't, because that would be a wonderful smoking gun. But the way that this all plays out demonstrates that Tracy had a complete understanding of what the War Department expected of him. He will cooperate with the War Department's demand, for example, to cut rations at Elmira 3 times over the course of his tenure, among many other things. Now, when the POWs first arrive at Elmira, they are going to be housed in tents. And you'll see this is a picture from the period. You'll see that these are the hills that overlook the area. You don't see it, but the river is back here. And so it's really quite a beautiful location. The POWs themselves commented on how beautiful a location it was. And here to be housed in tents in July 1864 or August 1864 is no big deal, because it's, you know, it's a very pleasant place to camp in the summer. But they were very, very slow at erecting barracks, which of course would be necessary when the cold weather arrived. More evidence that they weren't taking this seriously enough. Now, winter in Elmira, New York, can get pretty brutal, even worse than Harrisburg. Very brutal, very cold, and a wind whips down this valley of the Chemung. And, you know, winters in the late 19th century were worse than they are today. And so this was going to get pretty brutal into winter. But again, the War Department and others were saying, no, the war is going to be over by then. Don't worry about this. You know, we shouldn't spend the money putting up expensive barracks because the war is going to be over before the winter of 64, 65. And so they did very little to prepare for winter. And what this meant, sadly, is that many POWs are going to be in tents, lying on the bare ground with maybe a little bit of straw under them into January 1865. So we know that the first snow fell in October. So half the POWs are still in tents in late October. And by the time we get to January, there are still hundreds in tents. They have put up barracks for the rest, but the fact that there are still hundreds in tents is pretty damning. This is the inside, by the way, of a reconstructed barracks, so you can get an idea of the berths that the men slept on. You'll see that there's no insulation at all, and these were just plain pine berths. They were not given any straw or mattresses. Each man was assigned 2 blankets, and that would be what they would have to keep them warm. You see that there's no insulation around the windows either. So the wind is just going to howl through this place. And howl it did. Now, food was an issue in Elmira, and it really should not have been. Elmira is farm country, and that men in Elmira should suffer from things like scurvy is just really inexcusable, because the amount of vegetables available in the Elmira area was, you know, they were very, very plentiful, like they are today. The one area that there is some legitimacy in is that beef was scarce, and that was largely because, you know, of the needs of the Union Army. But there was plenty of pork and other meats available. But as I said, there was a concerted effort by the War Department to cut rations to Confederate POWs, not just in Elmira, but to all POW facilities run by the Union Army, whether that was Point Lookout or anywhere else. Those rations were cut, as I said, in retaliation for what happened to our men in places like Andersonville. And there was quite the market in dressed muskrat, let me tell you. For two plugs of tobacco, you could get yourself a nice dressed muskrat. When they couldn't pallet this, they would dig roots, or sometimes they would eat their shoes or other leather that came to hand. But food really never should have been an issue. Sadly, it did become one. Now, what are these guys going to do to keep their sanity? Well, it depended upon their natures. Some of the POWs in Elmira just kind of sat down, lost all hope, and faded away, and eventually die of what appears to be depression or a broken heart or whatever, Those that found a way to keep busy were the ones that did best in Elmira, whether that be hunting muskrat, to feed their fellow prisoners, or a lot of them began just to make things, and they would make jewelry, or they would make wooden dice, a whole variety of different things, and they would actually sell them in town. Now, they couldn't go into town themselves, so they made these deals with the guards. So the guards would bring them supplies. They would make these into things. The guards would then take these things in the community and sell them. Some of the money did get actually back to the prisoners, though they weren't allowed money while they were incarcerated, but the money went into accounts held by the POW camp, and when they were released, they were given the money. It wasn't really as corrupt as it might have been. But some of these things you can see in the Chemung Valley History Museum there on Water Street in Elmira today, like this jewelry. The primary currency in Elmira was tobacco. North or south did not matter, whether it was exchanged between guards and prisoners or prisoners and prisoners. Tobacco seemed to be all things to all men. Now, the winter of 64-65 was absolutely brutal. We know that there was a dozen inches of snow on the ground by December 1st. That largely remains there as a base, and so just more snow goes on top of it. It was also brutally cold that winter. And while the barracks had 2 coal stoves each, they were given a ration of coal. And so they got the ration at the beginning of the day, and that was to last for 24 hours. So what usually happened is that, for 12 hours, they would be, generally comfortable. But for the other 12 hours, they would freeze until they got a new ration of coal. Now, going into the early spring of 65, Benjamin Tracy had been warned over and over and over. You need to plan for spring, because when that snow on those hills starts to melt, this whole valley is going to flood, and the Chemung River will come booming, and it will just wash away the whole camp. So you'd better get ready. Well, Tracy did nothing, really less than nothing. He had, 6 months notice to plan something in case of the flood. And sure enough, there were a couple of warm days in early March just before St. Patrick's Day. And sure enough, the flood came and washed away much of Elmira, in fact. 85% of the palisade surrounding the camp was washed away in the first few minutes of the flood. And here you can see a depiction of flooding in the Elmira area. The fact of the matter was that all of Elmira was underwater, not just the camp. All of Elmira was underwater, the whole city. And parts of the camp were under many feet of water. Some parts of the camp up near Water Street were under 6 inches of water. So it depended upon where you were. But interestingly, nobody escaped. The opportunity was certainly there, but again, where are you going to go? You're certainly not going to jump into the river and try to swim away, because there's a lot of ice in that water, and you would freeze to death before you got any place to save yourself. And so, that's what prevented escapes. The saddest part of this was that down near the river was the smallpox hospital. They kept the smallpox hospital down, isolated from the rest of the population, and they didn't have time to evacuate the smallpox patients before the flood came. And so they had to mount this desperate middle of the night rescue effort to try to save these smallpox patients. And guards and inmates worked side by side through the middle of the night with jury-rig rafts and tow ropes, and all but one was saved, which is really kind of a testament to the effort. The one that wasn't saved was nearly saved, but before they could actually get hold of him, he fell into the river, and he'll die of exposure later. The water was very, very cold. The POWs that aided with this effort were given a ration of rum as a reward. Well, by this time, we're talking about, March, St. Patrick's Day, 1865. The writing was on the wall that this war was going to soon be over. Lee's army was absolutely starving in the trenches around Petersburg, and Grant could see that the writing was on the wall. He began to allow prisoner exchange again, even before the spring campaign was going to open. And so the camps began to empty out. Point Lookout and Elmira began exchanging and releasing prisoners, so that by the time we get to early June, there's only a handful of POWs still left in Elmira. And it's really quite interesting that many of the men that were released were, they just threw open the gates. The men are told to walk down to the railroad depot where they'd get, railroad passes from the Union Army to travel to their homes. But it's interesting to me when I was reviewing the information in the newspapers, and the accounts of the release of prisoners, how many of these guys didn't just rush right off home. And we're talking about hundreds of these guys stayed in the Elmira area for many weeks, patronizing local hotels and local restaurants. Some actually never go home. A handful decide that they like Elmira so well that they settle in the Elmira area, some near Ithaca. A lot of these guys use some of the money that they earned by making jewelry and other things. And it's not until late July that the camp is emptied out. Those that were too ill to travel were put in local hospitals, but most of them will eventually go home themselves. In the days after the camp was closed, the site where the camp was supposed to be returned, according to the contract with the farmer who owned the land, to the best of the Union Army's ability, back to the way it was. It was farmland after all. And so this was pretty much done. The buildings were removed or sold off. And within just a few years, you would never know that the POW camp was there. One physical reminder was the morgue, the dead house, which was bought by a local man. He turned it into a garage. He re-erected it just a couple blocks away, and school children to the turn of the century would be able to point this out to each other as part an original building from the POW camp. And today, if you go to Elmira, I've been talking about leading a bus tour there, if you folks are interested in. We will see the original camp building that was re-erected. This is this here. As I said, still a majority of the original lumber and hardware. There's also the replica barracks I told you about. You can also walk along the levee and see where much of the palisade was. It's an interesting place, not just the camp, but the various sites in Elmira. So, according to the numbers, some 400,000 were held as POWs in more than 150 different facilities over the course of the war. In total, 56,000 died. 13% of soldiers died in prison. whereas 5% mustered were killed in battle. And you'll see the totals for Confederate and Union facilities. In Elmira, less than 9,500 were held, 2,900 died in captivity. It's the highest death rate of any Union POW camp, and one of the reasons why it was called the Andersonville of the North. You'll see, by way of comparison, the numbers for Andersonville. I hope that if we get to do this bus tour, I will take you to the National Cemetery in Elmira, where most of those 2,900 Confederates still lie. And there is this very nice monument to the memory of these Confederate soldiers that you'll be able to see. It's a beautiful bas relief. And finally, I got to put in a word for my new book because I'm so excited about this. It's a biography of William Tecumseh Sherman, and it'll be out next month. Maybe I will have the opportunity someday to tell you about this. But for now, thank you very much, and I'll be happy to take any questions.
Hang on, I'm coming. Okay, great talk, Derek. Really enjoyed it. I say I'm about 3/4 of the way through your book, and I'm really enjoying your book on Elmira. So, anybody have any questions for Derek? Go ahead and unmute yourself and ask the question.
Yeah, Ricky, I have one. Great talk, Derek. Really enjoyed it. Learned a lot. My great-great-grandfather was captured after the Second Battle of Winchester and was incarcerated, I guess is the right term for it, on Belle Isle. You mentioned Belle Isle earlier in your talk, and if I understood you correctly, they took prisoners from Belle Isle and sent them further south to Andersonville. Is that what you were saying?
Those that were still alive.
Yeah. He was fortunate enough to be captured early enough in the war that they were still exchanging prisoners, and he was sent to a place called Camp Parole, which was somewhere in Maryland, and I think he escaped from there and made it back home to York, Pennsylvania. And after a few months, a policeman tapped him on the shoulder and said, "We've been looking for you."
Okay.
They put him back in the ranks as a teamster. I'm guessing that's because his feet were probably destroyed from the forced march to Richmond. But I used to feel sorry for him, and I still do to a certain extent. But after what you told us tonight, I think he may have been lucky that he,
to some extent, yes.
He did.
But let me tell you, Belle Isle was one of the worst of the POW facilities that was run by the Confederacy. You know, Libby Prison gets a bad rap, but really Belle Isle was so much worse. A lot of the famous pictures of Civil War POWs that we are familiar with that look like just skeletons with flesh on them are actually mislabeled as Andersonville, when a lot of those most infamous pictures are prisoners that came out of Belle Isle.
Oh my God.
And the one story that we will never know, and I think could have been worse than Andersonville, was Salisbury, North Carolina. There was a very large POW camp run by the Confederacy there, and all kinds of stories of atrocities. And of course, Union prisoners told all kinds of stories about those, but the Confederacy destroyed the records. And so we'll never have good numbers on, you know, those that were incarcerated at Salisbury. And I think there's a story to be told there.
Yeah.
Hey,
Thanks again. Very informative. I'll yield to Joe.
Derek, well done with your program. I have a little bit of a different understanding about how you covered it, even though POW camps are still pretty tough. What did the soldiers do during the day? I mean, I read about German POW camps, the stuff that happened in Vietnam to some of our POWs. You know, other than trying to eat and do some other things, did they have any kind of activities for the soldiers, or did they just leave them sort of their own?
So there were no programs or anything like that for those that were incarcerated. They were pretty much left to their own. They would be regular roll calls so that you could get a count to make sure there hadn't been any escapes. But other than that, they were left to their own devices. There was a remarkable amount of cooperation in some cases between the guards and the POWs, though, for example, there was this agreement whereby guards would get raw materials for the inmates to make jewelry out of, or wood projects. The camp commanders seemed to wink at this, you know, and didn't have much of a problem with it. So maybe that was their informal way of producing programs. We do know very famously in the spring of '65, as the camp was beginning to be emptied out, they found that they had a very famous botanist in their charge. So he was a Confederate prisoner that owned a nursery and had real talent as a gardener. And so he planted this elaborate garden just inside the gate of the POW camp. And people from the Elmira community clamored to come see this garden, which was, of course, inside the camp. And so the camp commanders could not let that happen, though somehow, apparently, people got in to see it, you know. And after the camp was closed, it became something of a tourist attraction for the locals, at least until the buildings were all sold off and everything.
Good story. Thank you.
Yeah, we have one question from Jolene. It says, can you talk more about what the locals thought about the soldiers, especially those who stuck around after being freed?
So, you know, there did not appear to be many accounts that I came across of harsh feelings. There was, in some cases, pity, you know. The people in the community of Elmira were fascinated, really, more than anything else, I think. There were observation platforms that enterprising people in the community erected. So you could go up in the platform, pay a nickel to look down on a real live rebel, you know, and get a souvenir on the way out, you know. There was a vibrant demand for stuff made by the prisoners. I mean, real competition for that stuff being made by those rebels. High demand in the community for this stuff, you know. And I think the reason why we have this stuff today has to do with that, you know, though I wish there was more of it still in existence, you know, but so much of it was made of organic materials that just broke down over time, you know. I think curiosity was mainly the attitude, you know. There was some pity. There were many humanitarian organizations that tried to send in clothes, to try to send in food, but the War Department would not allow this. The War Department would just not allow almost anything to get in. And that was because Edwin Stanton and the War Department felt that these prisoners needed to answer for what was being done to our men in Andersonville. Does that answer your question?
Yes, I think so. Dave? We can't hear you, Dave. Okay, you're muted now, but for some reason we can't get your volume, get you to talk. Oh, we still can't get you.
Can you unmute him, Ricky?
Yeah. Yeah. Unmute yourself, Dave.
How's this sound?
Yeah, I got you now.
Okay, sorry, wrong headset, wrong helicopter. I've read several places that Southern soldiers were not allowed to be buried in Union cemeteries or Union ground, and I noted that on the Woodland National Cemetery, there's Confederate headstones all over the place. Is that true? Because I know, like at Anderson and Tatum, you had to go over to Shepherdstown to find Confederate graves, not not on the Union Cemetery.
There was change over time in attitudes about where various people could be buried. You might know that the National Cemetery movement really is not a creation until around the turn of the century. And so local communities and states had more say before that time about who could be buried where and what they would tolerate. The burial ground in Elmira was not a national cemetery until much later. So it's kind of interesting that those 2,900 or so Confederates buried in Elmira were at that time buried in the Woodlawn Cemetery, which was a city cemetery, not a national cemetery, on a plot of land leased by the federal government. And that is where all the Confederates were buried kind of more or less together in a plot of about 10 acres of land. One of the great stories to come out of this, and it's one of the appendices of my book, is the story of John Jones, the caretaker of the Woodlawn Cemetery, who was a former slave himself, a runaway, that was on his way to Canada, but decided to stay in Elmira. He liked it so much and became a conductor on the Underground Railroad. Anyway, he later became sexton of the Baptist Church Cemetery and sexton of the Woodlawn Cemetery, and he was contracted to bury the Confederate prisoners who died at Elmira. And he took such care and was so meticulous with the records,
That's in this book, yeah.
They say that very few Confederate soldiers were ever moved out of Woodlawn, because people would come up to remove their loved ones and see how beautiful a plot of land it was, how well taken care of they were. The records were so well done that many of them decided to leave their loved ones in Elmira after all, which I think is absolutely fascinating. But so far as your question about who could be buried where, it really depended. It depended upon when, and it depended upon the individual community. That's the best I can do.
Thank you.
Okay.
It is a wonderful place. I hope that if we do the bus tour, I can take you to the National Cemetery there.
Okay, because we have to work on that one. Anybody else have any questions or comments for Derek? Let me just do a quick one here. No, I can't even find mine. Okay, like I say, I want to thank everybody. Our next meeting is going to be March the 6th, and it's going to be live, but we're also going to do Zoom and do Facebook for those who can't make it or too far away. But our speakers will be Diane Duggan, and she's going to do a first person. She's going to portray Loretta Valquez, who's a female soldier disguised as a man. She acted as Lieutenant Harry T. Buford. So I'll double check on the day, but it's going to be, again, the third Thursday. But it's going to be a first person. Like I say, it is going to be live. And like I say, we will have the Zoom and the Facebook setup. So anybody have any questions, last comments for Derek before we go?
Hey, Derek, well done. Thank you.
Excellent job. We really enjoyed it. I highly recommend it. We'll wait for your new book, but I highly recommend your book, Hellmira. Like I said,
Thank you.
I'm almost done with it, but it's really great.
Thank you.
Okay. Good night, everybody. See some of you guys tomorrow. Take care.